Welcome to Blink. Welcome to Lincoln University and on behalf of the whole Blink team. My name is Wim de Koning. This is our first innovation series of 2020 and I have a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. What do we do? Blink Innovation. We do basically three things. We innovate, we collaborate and we connect. And especially that connection, making sure that we talk to each other and make sure that we share our thoughts without polarizing. I think that is really important here at Blink. And hopefully today will be a very good example of that when we have somebody more from the research background, somebody really doing it in the ground, and somebody really looking at it from a more abstract global level, from perhaps also a risk point of view. We will have three speakers today, and what I'll do now, I will introduce all three to you. Then we will have 20-minute presentations from each speaker, and then after every speaker has spoken, there will be a Q&A session. I'm going to start with Susan. Susan, thank you very much for being here. Susan works for ANZ. She studied at Massey University, did a degree in agricultural economics. Then she started to work with ANZ in a graduate role. Then she moved on to the dairy industry in NZX, and she was leading a team of analysts and basically gathering market intelligence to make sure that the shareholders and the stakeholders were well informed. So then I'm moving on to Kate. Kate is actually, I gave her the compliment as well. It's like an example of diversification, what she is doing at the moment. Kate is a graduate of Lincoln University. She did a bachelor degree in vinology, and she did a master's in applied science here at Lincoln University. She is member of a group of fifth generation farmers, and they are running together with her family, her husband and three children. They're running Mount Somers, which is a very diversified agricultural enterprise. But I'm sure that Kate will tell us all about that. Then our third speaker will be Allison Stewart. Allison is CEO of FAR and originally coming from Scotland, and she founded Biosecurity, research center here at Lincoln University. I think a long time ago, before anybody else was basically almost worried about that. So it's definitely a lady with a lot of vision. At the moment, she is really focusing on plant protection, and she's looking at biologically based protection in the arable field. So, I was only given 10 minutes, so hopefully that is a little bit shorter. So I would like to introduce the first speaker, being Susan.
So 2020, so far, we've seen missiles flying around the Middle East. We've seen drought in Australia. We've seen fires. We've seen flooding. Here in New Zealand, we've also seen drought up north and flooding down south and on the west coast. We've seen Trump acquitted from his impeachment trial. Brexit has happened. We've seen the US-China trade deal, phase 1, kick into gear. And we've seen the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan in China and the devastation that that's causing to people and the spread of that. It's also been, it's always a busy start to the year. I've had kids home from school. We've tried to spend some time at the beach. We've had pony club camp. We've walked the route burn, probably one of the last people to walk it this year, to be honest. timed that quite nicely, actually. We've managed to draft some lambs and share the rest. We've drafted some ewes and they're still sitting in the paddock, probably will be for the foreseeable future. But it's been hectic. But and sometimes, when it's hectic like this, it's really hard to think about the bigger picture and what's happening and where things are going. So today I'm going to try and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in a global economic sense, also what we're seeing here in New Zealand and our own economy here, and then what that means for some of our major farming sectors. So firstly, 2020 was sort of poised as a year when we were going to see some improvement in global economic growth. We had a pretty slow year in 2019 when trade was really quite subdued due to the tensions between China and the US. So global trade sort of only grew at around 1% last year and was sort of poised. The expectation was that it would improve and pick up a little bit this year. It's looking increasingly unlikely that that's going to happen with some of the challenges we've got. Now, Brexit has officially happened, but it hasn't really happened because what's happened is it's been agreed that there will be, the EU and the UK will divorce and go their separate ways. But the trade implications and how it's going to affect everyone is still being negotiated. And, they've basically got to the end of the year to sort that out. So throughout this year, I expect we'll see a lot of sort of news and disruptions as people trying to figure out what this is exactly going to mean. Hopefully, it's certainly, given that they've got 12 months to sort it out, there is a good chance that we will start to see some improvement as the year goes on, but we'll definitely see some ups and downs. Now, to be honest, at the moment, New Zealand doesn't have fantastic access into the UK or the EU, so we do have potentially some upside potential in the longer term. But we're not going to see the UK or the EU doing serious negotiations with New Zealand on a trade agreement until they figure out what they're doing between each other. So, we can pretty much rule that out for this year to get something completely settled with New Zealand. It's more likely to be another year out. So, we'll still wait and see on that one. Now, the US-China, phase one of the trade deal has kicked in. And, largely what phase one is pretty much unwinding some of the tariffs that were added while they had this tension and while they were negotiating. So it's kind of put a lid on some of that. There is an agreement for China to take a lot more agricultural products from the US. It'll be really interesting to see if they can actually meet that agreement. It does mean the product that the US mainly has traditionally sent to China has been soybeans. And while China was buying less soybeans from the US, they were getting them from Brazil and elsewhere. So it does mean there would have to be a big shift back towards the US to get anywhere near those levels they're talking about. We do expect to see some improvement in access for US beef into that market. But I think it will be very, very gradual. US beef was shut out of that market for a very long time due to the issues with mad cow disease back in the early 2000s. It was reopened, but very little beef went in there before then these trade tensions sort of shut it out again. And it does take time to develop those supply chain relationships and move things through. So I think over time we will see a little bit more US beef going in there, but I don't think it's going to, I don't think that's going to happen overnight. It will take some time. But I guess globally the big focus at the moment, or the big unknown, the big risk, is really the spread of this coronavirus and how far and fast it goes. So far, it's been pretty tragic. There's been over 900 lives lost. There's huge disruptions within China, and even starting to spread a little bit further elsewhere. So from a human perspective, it's been absolutely devastating. From a trade perspective, the biggest challenge that we are really seeing that we've seen immediately was the extension of the Chinese New Year holidays, which has just basically slowed everything up, and we're just not seeing, factories haven't been open, ports haven't been opened, and everything's sort of very much sitting at a standstill. And it's also causing a lot of uncertainty around, immediate demand or future demand for some of our products. Now, Chinese New Year typically is a time of celebrating and feasting, and you see a lot of meals typically had at restaurants, and that's where a lot of our products go through that trade, as opposed to being consumed at home. So it's still a little bit unknown, the impact that we had on demand, but we know it will definitely be back considerably. And even before the disease was announced, we had already seen a bit of a slow up in demand for our meat products into that market. So right through 2019, we saw a real build in demand from China for both our beef, our lamb, and our mutton, as they were looking to replace the meat that was displaced from the issues that they had internally with their swine flu. But a week or so before Christmas, we did start to see an easing back in demand for imported meat. And that was partly to do with a little bit more meat coming in from other countries. So there had been a lot more plants approved around the world to supply that market. A little bit more turning of maybe a blind eye to some of the grey trade, some of the meat that sort of finds its way in, maybe not quite through the official channels. And we also saw a directive from the Chinese government to free up any stocks that were being held. So traders that had bought product in, they were asking them to move it forward and just they were sort of trying to keep a bit of a lid on food price inflation, because prices had got incredibly high. So we did see this backing off a little bit back before Christmas, and then that also sort of coincided with more throughput of both beef and lamb in New Zealand. So we had a lot of the lamb season was a little bit slow last year, so there wasn't as many lambs killed earlier, and then we sort of had a bit of a bottleneck. So we've now got more supply, and then a lot of uncertainty in that market. So what's that sort of meaning at the farm level at the moment is, the processes, China's become a really huge market for our mutton. So, decade or so ago, we might have sold a bit of mutton up into some of the island nations, into the Middle East. But for the last few years, China's been a massive market for mutton and pretty much soaked everything up. So now that we don't have that demand, we're seeing processors stop killing ewes for the time being, and so it's going to take a bit of time to work its way through. How quickly we see works resume, processing of ewes is a little bit unknown, but I think it'll be some time before they can work through the existing stocks, because we're having some challenges with just the amount of space that is available in terms of chiller and freezer space here and up in China. That said, we even just a week or so ago, there's been we have seen more inquiry, some inquiries starting to come out of China with prices back. There has been a little bit of interest in products, so we'll give it another week or two. We'll have a better sense of how quickly the situation is going to resolve. It'll also have a better sense of how many workers are stuck in their home provinces and can't get back to work, and how quickly factories reopen. So on the flip side, where it might be, we kind of think of China as mainly as an export market for us. We also import a lot of products from China. So and so that's having a sort of an impact right throughout the globe on supply chains. So you're seeing, you know, car factories shut down because they may not even be located in China, but they may be getting some parts that are coming through China. And it's actually quite hard to think about everything that we consume around, you know, where it's coming from. But China certainly has a massive influence. But there has been a directive to get factories reopened that supply essential medical supplies, and also imported food is also high up the priority list. So we'll just see how things pan out this week now that we're seeing greater numbers of workers back, and how that impacts us. In terms of the US this year, we have, I mean, it's also election year in the US as well as here in New Zealand. I think, you know, the US, we will see, you know, the typical tweets from Trump about how good the economy is going, and that he's been a little bit quiet through that impeachment time, but I'm sure it won't be long before we see, you know, a lot more action again. And you know, and that potentially has a slightly stimulatory effect, as you know, as people, you know, talking up the economy is never a bad thing. I guess it gives people a bit more confidence. So, but it's going to be really interesting to see where the trade tensions go this year. You know, we've still got there's still a lot more to be done with the US-China side of things. And the other area is the US and the EU negotiations. So that's something, you know, we're watching reasonably closely, because there will be no doubt some, it'll be interesting to see the style of negotiation, whether it's any different to the sort of style of negotiating with the Chinese versus the EU. In terms of back here in our domestic economy, we have seen some improvements in the last sort of 6 months or so to our domestic economy, but the signals are quite mixed. So inflation has picked up a bit, which is sort of a typical signal of how well our economy is going. We're seeing, you know, the housing market that sort of came off a bit in Auckland has taken off again. We're seeing, you know, sort of housing markets in more regional areas also reasonably buoyant. You know, employment levels are still high, and consumers are still pretty positive in terms of spending. We're not seeing the same confidence at the business level though, and we're not seeing wages growing. So we've kind of got a bit of a disconnect there. So, and certainly, you know, through the agriculture sector, that confidence is, you know, reasonably low. And, you know, not surprisingly, we've got a lot of uncertainties at the moment. I expect we will see, it's going to be a very busy time for the politicians for the first 6 months of this year. There's a lot of regulatory change that they're trying to push through. Water policy is one of the big ones, which has a pretty wide impact, and is going to impact most of us reasonably directly. So that's going to be one to really watch. I do get a sense, you know, there's a lot of work being done there, but I do get a sense we may see, you know, some sort of regulations that come out with general direction, but still with a lot of gaps in the detail that need to be filled in over time. So the more certainty we get, the easier it is to invest and to make decisions and to move forward. And it would be great if, you know, by the middle of the year we had some real clarity on that policy. I think we will have some more clarity than we have at present, but I don't necessarily think we're going to, you know, have absolute clarity there. So that's, you know, that is one of our challenges going forward. I do expect, you know, the policy will sort of end up sitting in a way that's, you know, generally aligned with what consumers are looking for around the world. And in this sense, I think we, as New Zealand, we actually are reasonably well placed in the sense that consumers are wanting to know that their food has been produced in a way that's, you know, that's kind to the environment, kind to the animals, kind to the people that are producing that. So I think this, you know, this will address some of that environmental concerns So I do see it as an opportunity. At the moment, once you're in it, and when I kind of look at our farm and think, Christ, I'm going to have to change that, and I'm going to do that, and that's not going to quite work. You do get a bit bogged and a bit negative about it, but when you can kind of sit back and look at the bigger picture, I think we can see it as quite an opportunity to actually be able to say, hey, look, this is how we produce food, and we can prove that we're doing it well and we're meeting these regulations. Our image on the world markets is a lot better than our domestic image, really, when it comes to that sense. And rightly so. We're lucky to have live in an environment where the air is fresh. We can all breathe clean air every day, and so can our animals. So I think some of the challenges going forward is going to be sort of capturing what we're doing and then telling these stories and linking it through to the market. And that's not going to be done by the government. The government are going to do regulation side of things, but that more personal touch on how we're doing things, why we're doing things, why we love farming, why we love producing food. I think that's where the opportunities really lie, and that's going to come down to each of us individually, looking at that. I think, having tourists or townies on your farm is a great way to kind of measure how other people see things. I think it's really important to see things through other people's eyes. It's really easy to sort of hang out in a group of people where everyone thinks the same, and we all sort of go, we think this, and someone else agrees, and we're like, yay, that's cool, we're all on the right track. But it actually does us probably it's a lot more useful to actually have some of our views challenged about why we're doing things. It makes us think a lot more about why we're doing things, about how we're doing things. And, I know as having grown up on a farm, you do kind of just go, there's a lot of things you do because it's normal. It's how it always was. And, and it's normal to you, but from somebody else's view, you can look in and see it in a completely different way. And being able to answer those and challenge yourselves is, I think, a great skill. So I think, in summing up, in terms of the year ahead, we're going to have a lot of uncertainty on the global markets. There's going to be a lot happening there. I think it's worth really while keeping abreast of kind of what's happening, trying not to get bogged too much in it, but kind of keeping an eye on what's happening and how that might potentially affect our own businesses. In terms of the domestic economy, we're expecting to see, a slight improvement in general across New Zealand. Like for instance, we're no longer forecasting any further cuts to the OCR, so there's another announcement on Wednesday. We're expecting things to be pretty flat, although there'll probably be a lot of acknowledgement of the global risks, but I think we will see, it'd be very unlikely that we'll see any movement there, so we have a little bit of stability in that sense. But I think that we will see, there's going to be a lot of regulatory changes to keep abreast of, and that's going to be, I see that as both a challenge and an opportunity for our primary sectors. Thank you. Okay, sit down.
Thank you, Susan. I learned a lot. Why do we love food? Why do we love farming? Let's be proud and let's be transparent. We will be challenged, both internationally, but also here domestically. But it also will give us opportunities. At least that's what I learned. I'm going to introduce Kate to talk about her farm and her operation. Forward. Yeah.
Cool. So this is Mount Somers Station, and this is where I farm with my husband David and our 3 children and our team of 14 staff. And because I'm a farmer, I have a large wad of notes here, so please excuse me. So my talk actually follows on really nicely from what we've just heard. We've heard about a whole lot of uncertainty and sort of the macro trends that are coming at us. And what that boils down to essentially is change. And be it change is something that we're dealing with in ever-increasing ways on the farm. And the pace of change that's coming at us is actually, at times, it's quite overwhelming and terrifying. And that might be change in operations, regulations, or a change in thinking, or even attitudes. So today, following on from what we've just heard, I'm going to talk really briefly about some of the practical ways that we're dealing with and adopting change on the farm, and how we actually transfer that change through our team of staff. So Mount Somers Station is 3,800 hectares, and it runs from the Ashburton River, about 400 metres altitude, up to the lower slopes of the mountain at 700. In the station, we've got around 500 hectares of native bush and native scrub that we've reserved, 200 hectares of forestry, 150 hectares of sort of traditional tussocky rolling downs. But the balance is really intensive, 10 hectare paddocks, and it's mostly cultivatable. We've got 12,000 Romney-based sheep, and we lamb around 145% on the ewe flock. We'll finish anywhere between 30 and 60% of the lambs, just depending on the season. We produce about 60 tonnes of wool in the 38 micron, which is very solidly carpet wool, and this year, or last year for the first time, we didn't cover the cost of shearing with our wool returns. We have 2,500 deer on the farm. These numbers are steadily shrinking. Environmental concerns or regulations really have really constrained where on the farm we can run deer. So the numbers are dropping every year. So what's been replacing the deer is a growing beef operation, actually, which ironically you'd wonder whether replacing deer with beef is good for the environment, but that's where we're at. So at the moment we've got 100 breeding cows, but we also get up to 500 dairy beef cross and bulls out of our dairy farm. We also have a dairy farm on part of the station that's 350 hectares. It's entirely unirrigated, and it runs about 2.5 cows to the hectare. This year we reared 750 calves out of it, which, as I said, we feed mostly into the livestock side of the station. We've also got a full-time beekeeper on staff with 450 hives. We have 11 houses on the property, and most of our staff live on farm. As well as the farm, we've also got quite a number of other sort of complementary or related businesses. So as you heard earlier, I trained as a winemaker initially here at Lincoln, and I set up Sugarloaf Wines in my early 20s. The business has grown pretty steadily, and we've now got 26 hectares of vineyards that are both owned and leased. And we've got a production winery that, there it is, exporting wine to 17 different countries and a permanent staff of 5. We own 2 local shops. Just one's a general store, one's a cafe. We sell a bit of farm produce and things. If you're ever on the inland scenic route, I'd highly recommend them. Right, Lambswool Blankets. That was one of our sort of early innovations, I suppose. It's an opportunity I identified a few years ago. I was looking for a New Zealand-made lambswool blanket, and I just couldn't find one. So I thought it couldn't be too hard. Set around organising to get some made, and I had a few false starts, learning my way around sort of wool terminology and weaving. I mean, it's a lost art in New Zealand. So that took a bit of go, but we did 100 blankets initially. We're doing 2,000 this year. We've got about 25 outlets around the country that we retail them in, and with an eye, I suppose, to export market development. As I mentioned before, we've got a full-time beekeeper on the staff. Honey was another diversification opportunity that we identified 3 years ago, and we went full swing into it, chasing the Manuka honey. And I'm sure a lot of you know what's happened to the Manuka honey market in that time. But we also get beechwood honeydew as well from the beech forests. And this is our latest project. It's only a couple of months old. Somerton's Sparkling Honey Mead. So with the collapse in honey prices this year, we ended up with about 10 tonne of honey in our shed that we just couldn't sell. We couldn't even get $2 a kilo for it. And I'd just come back from the States on a marketing trip for the wine, and the craft beer market's really massive over there, obviously, and there's people playing around with honey mead. And if you don't know what mead is, it's a fermented honey wine, and it's an ancient alcoholic drink. And it's normally really cloyingly sweet and sickly, but what we've been playing around with is actually making a lower alcohol, sparkling version. So it kind of drinks like a cider, but it's really honey flavoured. It's delicious. We did 1,000 litres before Christmas, and I've got 10,000 litres going down the canning line this month. So I'm just going to leave this here so it imprints beautifully in your brain. But anyway, we at Mount Somers, we're doing a lot of different things. And but like most farmers our age, debt, equity and land values are a major concern for us. And like every farmer in the country, changing regulations and expectations, especially on the environmental front, is what keeps us up at night. So David and I, we don't actually consider ourselves to be terribly innovative. What we focus on farm, like most farmers, I suppose, is feeding our stock as well as we can with the feed we've got available to maximise our production. Like, it's a very simple formula. But we do consider ourselves to be really receptive and resilient to change. And it's something that we actually pride ourselves on. So we make a real effort to be widely engaged outside the farm gate. We're both involved in industry good governance groups, which we get. Although we give a lot to that, I think we get a lot more than we give. We read and we engage really widely across all political spectrums. I mean, I'm following the Greens, the Labour Party, everyone on Facebook. It's so even if we don't agree with it, we try to be really aware of what is happening. And we also try and fully immerse ourselves and engage in the market for our products. So we try and keep an awareness of those macro trends, both political but also in the market. And I guess this awareness is what's led us to identify some of all these opportunities that we've just talked about that might be considered innovative. Following through with them requires a bit of bravery, but the key for us is that they never interfere with the main engine of the farm and the simple premise of feeding those stock well for strong production. So wool, blankets, honey and mead, they're all opportunities of value add to the business without affecting that core. Across all of our businesses, we've got a staff of between 30 and 40, depending on the time of the year. And given that David and I are both quite chaotic in our management style, managing the relationships and actually instilling change or culture across the wider organisation is a real challenge of ours. So about 2 years ago, we went through the process of defining our vision and values for the business, and we attempted to articulate these in a way that was really clear and succinct. And so initially that was just for the farm, but over time we're sort of rolling this out throughout the entire organisation. It wasn't actually a hard process. I guess the wordsmithing of it took some time, but because once we started, it actually all just flowed out in about an hour. So wait for it. There we go. The vision that we have for our operation is that we're a highly diversified, values-led, multi-generational agribusiness that our families and our staff are proud to be part of, centred around our 3 key pillars of success: place, people and profit. And the reason I've got a picture of our kids up there on the top of Mount Somers is that we really quickly identified that the thing that is most important to us is our family and passing on that legacy. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we need our children to farm, but we need our children to have a real ownership of the importance of farming and what that means to us and to our country. So place. We recognise that our land is fundamental and central to our vision. We value the health and integrity of our land and our native habitats, and we take a 100-year view on decisions. And that 100-year view is a key one because it doesn't just relate to decisions around what tree we plant or where we put a fence line or operational things, but it helps us sort of frame our viewpoints, and it helps us react in our thinking to trends. Like, we're in this for the long term, so we try to sort of have a view up here rather than riding those waves down low. With our people, we recognise we can't do it without our people, so we aim to provide a safe and secure environment for our people to foster their development and recognise that our farm is their home. And we value our community and we remember the achievements of those who came before us as we plan to the future. And then, of course, lastly, profit, with the bit of liquid gold running there. Just recognising that in order to farm sustainably, we have to make money. We have to farm profitably. So we set high expectations, we remain agile and flexible and open to change. So David and I have always prided ourselves on farming with a strong set of values. Essentially, it's a feeling of what's right and what isn't. But the process of articulating the values and the vision, it's not only cemented them in our decision making, but it's helped us in managing our relationships and communication both internally and also externally. For our staff, it's given them the why for a lot of what we do, and we'd like to think it gives them a sense of pride of being part of a greater thing. So we're working towards having a team that shares our visions and values, but also is open and communicative and really highly receptive to change. So an example would be instilling change in the team around some of the more recent environmental regulations that have come into force. The staff, they realise that these things are important to us, and it's becoming part of our culture. A great example is break feeding of crops and pasture. So it's the junior staff now that are asking the questions: what's the way we should fence this? Where are the waterways? Where's the trough? Are there any runoff issues? And when you've got 500 paddocks, it's actually really important because we can't be everywhere to double check what's going on. So them taking ownership of the problem is really critical. Open communication with the team, especially the senior team, means that they're taking ownership and transferring those changes through. 2 years ago, we recognised on the farm that a key weakness was actually poorly grown out ewe lambs, which brought our overall production down. So we incorporated large areas of lucerne and clover finishing pastures into the system, and we prioritised the replacement stock on these, and we do a big draft of store lambs really early in the season to let us do that. So previously, our focus had been all about getting fat lambs out the farm gate for short-term money in the bank, and that was how our livestock staff measured their success, which was led by us. So a drastic shift actually to focus almost exclusively on that replacement stock, ignoring finishing lambs, required a really major mindset change. And it's only happened because the goal and the outcomes have been really clearly communicated and the staff have taken ownership over it. Another example might be growing specialist crops and pastures specific to soil type and having our senior staff understand why we're doing it. In our dairy system, we ruled out very early on the use of PK for all kinds of reasons. And we wanted to be self-sufficient in our dairy farm, and that was for both profitability reasons but also environmental, because if we're importing feed in, then our NLOS number increases. But given that we're not irrigated, it can be quite a challenge. So once our dairy manager was on board for the why, like the why we're not importing masses of feed into our dairy system, we started exploring the use of alternatives. And we've incorporated pure lucerne swards and Rhaphno brassica onto our milking platform. We've just come out of a period of 45 days with virtually no rain. And the only thing that was still green on the lower terraces of our dairy farm were the lucerne and Rhaphno. So it's fair to say it was a success, and by next season we'll have a third of our milking platform in a pure lucerne sward. For our external relationships, be it our bankers or accountants or advisors or agents, identifying and articulating our vision and values has given us confidence and helped validate some of those decisions. So when your banker or your accountant come to realise that money is not your primary motivation, they might not like it, but they develop there's a mutual respect, and that they start to understand the reasoning. So there's things that we won't feed, and there's areas that we won't develop. And the staffing decisions we've made, there's probably all kinds of decisions that on the surface of it don't seem logical. But with a deeper understanding of the operation and what drives us, what's our why, it actually becomes clear. I mean, the first hurdle of any innovation or opportunity that we come across sort of very quickly becomes, does this fit within our defined values? The beekeeping operation ticked all kinds of boxes, but mainly it wasn't a way of intensifying the business without intensifying our footprint on the land. It tied in really well with those areas that we'd chosen to retire from grazing, and potentially before the Manuka price saga, it would have added considerably to our profitability. But this season's looking really good for Manuka honey, by the way. I guess the other main point to be clear on is that we are far from the only farming business with a vision and values. There are farmers up and down the country who share a similar ethos, and they feel just as strongly about it. I'm not sure how many of those have actually taken the time to articulate and record their values, though. And then when we get into this conversation about social license to operate and farming practices, we're essentially talking about values. And I really struggle with the term social license because it's a catchphrase. And the issue with social license is that whose values actually matter. You'd struggle to find a farmer in the country who didn't argue that they pride themselves on looking after their land and animals, and that nobody should tell them how they should run their farm. By and large, as farmers, we've all got strong values, but I'd actually argue that farmers' values aren't the ones that we need to be looking at when we talk about social license. So as farmers, we are in the position of, or the business of producing food to sell into a defined market or a number of defined markets. If we don't produce the product for the specification that the market requires, they're not going to buy our product, which is fair enough. But when we start to talk about social license, it's not the specifications of the product, but it's the conditions in which the product's produced that matters. So essentially, it's the market's values judgment on how we are farming. As a bit of a generalisation, I would suggest that New Zealand farmers could benefit from a little more outside-in thinking and exposure, and looking to the market to try and gain an understanding of what really matters to the people who are buying our product. Who are they, and what are their values? And how many farmers can even name where our products go? So I don't know how we can actually connect to the market. And this might be something that we can all do at farm level through reading and exposing ourselves to different media and talking to people outside our immediate circle. Or it could be something that NZ Inc. do as a wider exercise and do a bit of sort of pan-sector insights work into what our markets want and what they're thinking, and then communicate that through to farmers. I mean, I know a lot of market insights work happens commercially, but I'm actually not convinced that this is getting communicated to farmers and whether farmers have any real sense of connection to their market. On the domestic political side, it's somewhat easier, and as farmers, following on from what we've just heard, like we all need to make an effort to engage outside the farm gate and to understand the values of the other side. We need to understand the values of our market, both internationally and domestically, and to see how our set of farming values fits within this. There's bound to be a shift required, probably from us, but if we've articulated our values, we can then make an assessment of just how far we're prepared to shift. But we all do need to be open to some change. And it's also a two-way thing. The market needs to understand our values. When we identify and articulate our farming values, we also need to be prepared to tell our story better. We need to open the farm gate and tell the honest story. We have livestock and dead stock, good days and bad days. But if we're communicating our greater overarching vision and values, then the market and the wider political sphere will get a better understanding of those values that we all have. And then perhaps social license within this country will become less of an issue. So supporting and assisting farmers to both articulate their values and communicate their story to connect to the market needs to be a priority, I think, for our processing companies and our industry groups. For our business at Mount Somers, this process of articulating our vision and values, it's given us a solid foundation to make long-term decisions and to see through the short-term chaos
to a future destination. I mean, it's helped us communicate change and be adaptable and resilient in what is currently a really uncertain present.
Whoa. Thank you very much, Kate. That's an interesting one, right? 100-year vision, 100-year looking forward, and then our government is changing every 3 years. That's a challenge. That's a real challenge. And I think what I've learned from Kate is that if you embed that in a vision and you actually are willing to live that vision and you're actually willing to execute that vision and go and have these battles with these stakeholders that are out there, you could be successful. Thank you very much, Kate, for that. I'm going to introduce Allison from FAR.
Well, that was it, was it? That was the introduction. Sorry, I'm Allison from FAR. I was waiting for something a little bit.
Before we started, I introduced all three of you.
I'm
but I can do it. I can do it again.
It's my Scottish sense of humour. Don't take offence.
And this is. And this is my Dutch sense of humor. I'm really, really sensitive. So this is Allison, guys.
Okay. So a little bit of a sort of insight into where I see arable going into the future. And I noticed when Kate was talking that it takes a wee while for the slides to sort of turn. So if we're talking about arable, we're talking about cropping, but I guess most people understand that in New Zealand, although there's a hardcore group of cropping farmers in Canterbury, if you look at cropping farmers across the whole country, many of them are actually mixed cropping livestock farmers. And so when we look at our research that we do for the arable sector, we're always having to understand that many of our growers are actually sort of also got beef and sheep or dairy or horticulture on their farms. And so when we start looking at farm systems, we have to sort of have our fingers in a number of other pies and make sure that the cropping component isn't being looked at in isolation of what else the growers are doing on their farm. So, even if you're a mainstream cropping farmer, you will still often have livestock coming onto your farm as part of a seasonal grazing sort of system. And if you look at where most of our produce goes, it's going into sort of human food, sort of for baked goods with the millers, or it's going into producing grain and silage to feed livestock. And then, of course, we also cover the seed industry. And I guess we think that we actually underpin the entire pastoral livestock industries in New Zealand, which we do because we produce the seed. That's not really sort of understood or recognised by the livestock sector, but that's okay. We know that we actually hold the entire power of the country in our hands. We just don't get paid well enough for it. Okay, so if you look at cereal production, because cereals are our main foundation of our rotation, we're growing about 100,000 hectares of cereals in the country. That's tiny compared to Australia and the US and Canada and other countries. And of course, we're producing that for ingredients for the domestic commodity market. So if you were ever going to be in a space that you don't want to be in, it's producing commodity ingredients for a small domestic market. So you think, ugh. But, and not surprisingly, if you look at production areas over the last sort of like nearly 20 years, in general, they're declining. And a lot of that decline here was related to, moving over to intensive dairying in the Canterbury area. But obviously, as that increased, they had more requirement for animal feed, and so our acreage went up again, and now it's coming down again. The only good thing is that our productivity has been increasing year on year on year, and so we've been able to overcome that reduction in acreage with better productivity. We probably are now plateauing out. I mean, we hold the world record for wheat production and barley production, and given the environmental compliance issues that we now deal with, we can't drive productivity any further than we've got. I mean, our average tonnes per hectare for, say, sort of wheat might be 12 or 13, up to 14 tonnes per hectare. In Australia, their best is like 3 or 4 tonnes per hectare. So we are really good at our job, but we're in that commodity ingredient domestic space, and that's hard to take when you're dealing with incredibly technically competent growers producing high quality produce and getting paid relatively small amount for it. But if you look at farm profitability, and the only things that you really need to look at is that, EBITDA per hectare for irrigated dairy is about 3,000, and for mixed cropping it's about 1,000, and our top mixed cropping farmers it's about 1,500. So we're nowhere near as profitable per hectare as irrigated dairy. But if you look at, and we have a sort of series of benchmarking systems where we actually drill down and look at individual crops and things like that. And if you look at gross margins, and this is just for autumn wheat, you can see there's a big range between $880 up to nearly $3,000. So we've got a lot of opportunity to enhance profitability. So we know that there are a lot of growers that can achieve good profitability. And the aim of FAR is to try and get the bulk of the industry up to that same level of profitability as the high performers. So as far as opportunities are concerned, yes, there is a perceived shift in dietary habits with more people talking about plant-based produce. I think there is a reality check on that. We know that there is absolutely a demand for safe, sustainable food with a good environmental footprint, and so the arable crops fit very well into that consumer sort of market need. We know that there's the opportunity to diversify our production systems and dial in a lot of other sort of new crops that hopefully can open up new products. So if you were looking at it, you could say your business as usual is okay, but there is a picture out there that could be a lot better. But you've also got an awful lot of challenges, because you can dial in all sorts of new crop opportunities, but if they don't give the grower any greater return on that, then you're not necessarily going to be any better from an economic sustainability point of view. We've got all this environmental compliance stuff that's being thrown at us at the moment. From an arable point of view, water and nutrient management is a key, soil erosion, and obviously we do have to address our greenhouse gas emissions. We've also got big issues around biosecurity, because we have often up to 20 or 30 different crops being grown. We've got the risk of an awful lot of pests and diseases that could come through the system. The upside is that because we have 20 or 30 crops, if we did have a major biosecurity incursion, it's not going to completely undermine our industry, because we can always move and do something else. So we've got a level of resilience because of the diversity of our cropping system that a lot of the intensive monoculture-based industries don't have. Our big threat, though, is crop protection from the point of view of, we've got a lot of resistance building up to key pesticides. We've got consumers demanding, increasingly more stringent regulations around risks of residues in the food chain. And then we've got a huge number of products that are being deregistered and pulled off the market. And New Zealand's got a very small market size, and so a lot of the big companies don't even bother registering some of the products in New Zealand because they won't make enough money. And so, actually managing, sort of our pest and disease problems are going to become increasingly more difficult. So what does that say? If you look at the greenhouse gas stuff and you're in the arable sector, you're really under the radar. I mean, the focus of the government and the general public's perception is all about sort of like, you know, dairy over here and, you know, sort of we're here. And that would be really easy to sit back and say, well, we don't really need to do anything because we're not really the problem. But actually, everybody is the problem. And I think that this is what we've all got to take collective responsibility around this. And just as much, you know, as dairy does and beef and sheep do, the tourism industry does, as does, you know, sort of the urban communities as well. So we'll do our bit because we have to. We can't hold any other industry accountable in the environment space if we don't show that we're actually doing something as well. So if you look at where is our, if you look at wheat as a classic example, where do most of our emissions come from? They come from the manufacture and application of fertilizers, and principally nitrogen fertilizers. So the biggest contribution that our industry could make to reducing greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce the amount of nitrogen that we're putting on our crop, which of course the fertilizer companies hate when I say that, but the reality is we have to do our bit. We've driven productivity over the last 20 years by putting more synthetic inputs into our system. We've put more fertilizers on and we've put more pesticides on. We now have to understand and learn how to maintain that productivity, but with reduced synthetic inputs. And that's our goal, so that we can hold our head high and say, well, we're doing our bit for the environment. So we can diversify our crop rotations, and that does bring, you know, a greater resilience, more biodiversity into the system. We have to reduce our synthetic inputs, and we have to improve our soil health. I mean, in reality, arable soils in New Zealand are actually relatively healthy compared to arable soils overseas. So I do get a little bit nervous when people say that, you know, we've got to improve soil health because you're suggesting that it's bad, but it's not. It's good, but it could be better. And it could be better because we do have to understand how to minimize some of our cultivation practices and reduce some of the soil erosion that we know is occurring. And there's a huge, big program of work on cover crops and, you know, embracing some of the principles of, you know, sort of agroecology and regenerative agriculture. And so we support those initiatives, but we're not sort of like embracing this sort of like religious mantra that goes with it, because the reality is that arable cropping in New Zealand is already quite good, and all we're trying to do is make it better. So the word regenerate suggests something's bad and you're trying to get it back to normal. We're normal and we're trying to make it even better. So we need a different mantra. So when it comes to pesticides, we're working really closely with the vegetable and the horticulture industry, and we have gone into this big program called A Lighter Touch, which is a $20 million program of work looking at how we can reduce the amount of synthetic pesticides that are going into our crops and replacing it with things like softer chemistry, biologicals, cultural practices, and bringing back some of those traditional old physical practices that, you know, that our grandfathers, etc., used before a lot of these chemicals were around. And so I guess what we have to do is, how do we do this without losing 20 or 30% of our yield? And that's the challenge, because it's easy to do if you're going to accept a yield decrease. But we don't want to accept a yield decrease because our profitability will just go out the window. So the challenge is we want a win-win, less synthetic inputs, but as much productivity, and that will make us more profitable. So FAR has gone from being a fairly traditional R&D levy-funded agency doing agronomic things to suddenly doing a whole load of value-add work, looking at biosecurity, looking at integrated farm systems, climate change, sustainable management systems, and trying to work out how we can integrate all of that research into really diverse farm systems. And so the challenge for us is we're the smallest sort of levy-funded body with the greatest diversity of farm systems that we have to try and support. And it is a challenge. And so we constantly have to be looking to see how we can leverage our money, our small amount of levy money, with government funding and with other sectors to see if we can actually get a sort of double banks for our buck. So where are we going? I mean, we would be silly not to have a good look at opportunities in plants for protein. And there are a number of different initiatives out there looking at various protein-based crops. There's huge opportunities for plant-based milks, and there are a number of opportunities in New Zealand with different companies and enterprises looking at oats and hemp and various other crop-based products. We know that seed crops are our highest value add into our rotation, and so we're exploring what other seed crops could we be growing, like sunflower, and you saw hopefully in the newsletters last week, that we've really started to start a little bit of a market in sunflower. We've also got to recognise that we need more homegrown grain, and we need to have some story we can tell around that. So AFIC, which is the Arable Food Industry Council, which includes the growers and the millers and the bakers, etc., we've come up with a big initiative that we're trying to drive at the moment, which is around self-sufficiency in milling wheat by 2025. Pretty ambitious, and we probably won't achieve it, but it's a good goal to have, because even if you get some progress towards that, it's better than nothing. So New Zealand bread is made primarily from Australian grain, and most consumers don't realise that. So we did a market survey, and most consumers think that when they go and they buy bread at the supermarket, they're buying bread that was made from grain that was grown in New Zealand. But it's not, of course. More than 75% comes from Australia, and it comes from Australia because they can produce it more cheaply because they're producing much larger acreages, and they can get it across the Tasman cheaper than we can get it from the South Island to the North Island. And it's crazy. And they will sign up to 5-6 year sort of contracts. Our problem is not, well, it's not a problem. Our issue is that our growers can get more money for growing wheat to feed animals than they can to feed humans. And I think that's a really sad situation, that we're prepared to pay more to feed our cows than we are to feed the people of New Zealand. And so we know from the consumer survey they want homegrown grain. They think they're getting it, and we're going to have to explain to them that they're not. And we know that for homegrown grain, that we can get a premium of about 40 cents on a $3 loaf. So we're just about to go into a major program of work, trying to work out how we can convince the consumer to demand homegrown grain and pay a little premium for it. Now that 40 cents obviously will get divvied up along the supply chain, but even if 8 cents of that goes to the grower, it will double their profitability overnight. And that is like a game changer for our growers. So it might cost us $1 million, more than $1 million, in a major consumer insight program to get consumers to understand what the situation is and drive and demand sort of produce from the supermarkets. But imagine doubling the profitability of your industry in a short period of time with just an 8 cent sort of added value. And that's the sort of thing that we have to take up that challenge. Yep. Protein crops, well, we're in that space, but we don't really buy into the hype that is out there about how this will transform New Zealand. I mean, it's just a load of bullshit. If you look at where you can legitimately grow all of these different crops, you've got these patches, and the problem is that when you go and talk to people who are in that space, and I bet you're up there at the back from Leaf, often what they do is they do their business case for these new opportunities based on giving the growers the equivalent to what the growers are getting for growing the crops that they're growing at the moment. So if I was a grower, I'd say, well, why am I going to bother growing your bloody protein crop when I can grow something that I know I can grow, that I've been growing for 20 years and I'm getting the same? So if you're going into the protein crop space and you're investing a huge amount in new things, you bloody well better make sure the grower gets a little bit more money than they're getting at the moment. Otherwise, you haven't got growers to produce your product. That was probably a little bit harsh, but... Okay, secondary revenue streams. So we have a situation in New Zealand with all of our cereal cropping. We have about 30% of the growers who incorporate the residue back into the soil. We have about 40% who burn it. And we have about 30% who bale it, and a contractor comes and sells it for bedding or whatever. We are looking to see if that revenue, we can get another revenue stream from that. And so, we're working with Scion, who have expertise in bioenergy and biomaterials, to look to see what options we've got, for wheat straw and barley straw that could open up a niche, high-value export market. So we're not interested in low-level ingredient commodity. What can we do with wheat straw or barley straw that will just open up a little added value niche? And it doesn't have to be very big, and it doesn't have to be very much, because it's all extra dollars in the back pocket of the grower, because it's a secondary waste stream. Okay, and then you can go into sort of like the little eclectic sort of fairly high risk things: GM-free soya, corn, canola, ingredients for 3D printing, seeds for vertical farming, feed for aquaculture. So we've got fingers in all of those. We're not doing the research, but we're supporting sort of entrepreneurial companies to explore those options, with the idea that maybe one of those might come off in the next 10 years and add, a little bit of value to the growers. Because if you look at these sort of functional food type things, this is the product value per hectare for a functional beverage based on oats, and this is the little pittance that the grower gets. So somehow it would be nice to just get that up a little bit and make arable growing, and sort of really good land use option for New Zealand. So where do I see our farming go? I think there's going to be a lot more mixed cropping livestock, because I think you get the win-win with livestock and crops in the same system. And I don't buy into this thing about, plant-based meat versus animal-based. I don't understand why we have to have either or. I think that we should have both, and it should be a win-win. And if we're clever enough, we should be able to work out how to achieve that. And I get really frustrated with the livestock sector when they keep trying to defend the status quo, because the status quo is not good enough. We should always be evolving, always changing, always looking for innovation. And I believe that there's huge innovation to be had by mixing and matching the very best of plant and animal-based sort of products. If you're going to stay in arable, then you're going to have to be bigger, and to get efficiencies of scale, and you're going to have to be in that minimal inputs. And so I see that there's going to be a lot of much larger arable farms that are really in that precision ag space. We'll have some growers that go into the eco-farm space, because I think there will be a little premium there. So they won't necessarily get the same yields, but they might get a premium for the whole sustainability. And then depending on where we go with carbon, there may be an opportunity for some of our growers to get into the sort of the carbon farming. So lots of interesting spaces to go. And we're not driving any one of these as better. We're actually saying, go for the one that you think you can make work in your region and go for that diversity. Very quickly, we've decided that there's only 15 to 20 people in FAR. We've got 3,000 growers. We connect with about 500 of them really well, but we don't connect with that other sort of, 2,500. And so we've decided that we've got to completely change the way that we interact with growers. And it's got to be facilitating growers to lead change and bring other growers on board. And so we're just developing a major new knowledge exchange platform about empowering growers to make the changes and to take the risks and to develop the diversified systems. And we know that we've got our high-performing growers have got all of those good attributes. They've got good business acumen. They're always learning. They understand their markets, and they take calculated risks. And we want to be able to show mainstream growers that if you have those attributes, you can constantly evolve and improve. And I'll leave it there. Okay.
Allison, thank you very much. I think the most important thing that I learned from Allison's talk is that arable farming is really important.
See, you're my friend now. After not introducing me properly, he's my friend now.
But what I also heard Allison say is that we need to look at problems in a holistic manner. We need to look at our stakeholders around us, and we should not be compliant if we are really good, because then we need to strive always to be better. I also basically heard all three ladies say, listen, it is valuable that we in the primary industry are moving up into the chain. And with that, I am going to invite all three ladies up for a Q&A session. There will be microphones in the audience. The Blink team will actually give you microphones, and I will share mine as well. It is important, because this event is live streamed, that we use microphones so that everybody can hear you. Questions from the audience?
Is that going? Kate, I'm really interested in your 100-year vision, and I'm wondering how you go around getting your stakeholders on board, and if you have any examples of changes they've made to support that vision. I really liked it.
So who specifically do you mean by stakeholders?
Oh, anybody that's involved in the business, suppliers, anybody, processors. Bankers, yeah, particularly.
So I guess for us, this whole process of articulating the vision, it is a process. And the first step for us was actually identifying what was important to us and how we frame our decisions. So in that 100-year vision, I guess we don't have necessarily stakeholders on board, but I guess for something like the banking relationship, maybe just their understanding of what drives us. And the 100-year vision was inspired from actually listening to one of the Maori corporations and how they look at land and how they treat their business and their little piece of land. And that really struck a chord with us. So that's where the 100-year thing has come. But I mean, as I said before, it really helps us sort of ride those waves and think, actually, this is happening down here, but what is important is way up here. Yeah.
Any more?
I'll just say a couple of things to challenge, so please respond accordingly. Just a little bit of background. I come also from a farming family. We think we go back also a long time, like nearly 300 years. I'm 20 years an apprentice Kiwi, as you notice by my accent. I've got now a small dairy farm on the west coast, 5 meters of rain, so I need to deal with damage and with Mother Nature, and tourists driving through the farm, etc., etc. But what I've learned in the 90s, when I was also technical manager of a large farmer cooperative in the north of the Netherlands, is a lot of these initiatives you just put forward is diversification, environmental compliance, added value. They came all through, and we did a lot of those things. But the hardest thing was it to make it financially work and to get the added value back into the farmer's pocket. And I'm 100% pro-farmers, and I was involved in a number of those projects, and people made serious investments on their farms, but the money did not come back to it. It became either the new standard or the consumer. 90% on the questionnaire informed, yes, we want this, we love this. And then they did the supermarket test, and only 10% of the people actually bought it, and it was only maybe 50 cents to their daily meal per day. So I'm not being negative, but just saying, how do we capture our extra effort in a dollar? And secondly, I deal with a lot of farmers' budgets now as well, and see financially they need to keep moving here, because otherwise they don't pay their interest and the amount of money the bank wants back. So how, and I think you're an example of it, how do you step out of that treadmill? How do you have enough time to do it? And how do you get that money back onto a farm level? That's what I've been through that process, and I like to see it happening in reality, not in thoughts. So sorry, this may be a challenge, but there you go.
Thank you. Ladies, who wants to react?
Well, I mean, you're right, and you're not saying anything that that people don't understand. But the issue is, it comes back to risk and reward. I mean, if growers want to just grow crops, and pass them on to somebody else to process and add value and take them up the value chain, then they are price takers, and they'll get the price that the market will want to give them. And so if you're a grower and you want more money for doing what you're doing, you have to be prepared to make an investment into something new. And so, whether it's a new crop or a new processing plant or something, it's risk and reward. You don't get financial rewards if you're not prepared to take risks. So I get quite frustrated with some of my growers when they say, well, what's FAR doing to add value to my farm? And where are all these new crops going to come from? And I want $4,000 per hectare profit. And I sort of say, well, what are you doing? Have you invested in any new initiative in the last 10 years where you've taken a risk and tried something new? Because if the answer is no, don't come and have a go at me. Because growers are business people. You're in the business of producing a product that the market either wants or doesn't want, and the market will decide what the price is. And I think that you both made that point, that if you're a grower and all you're interested in is farming, doing exactly what you've done, and hey, I've done this for 100 years and I should still be allowed to do it because I look after the land, then you're on a hiding to nothing, because the markets change every decade, every 4 years, every 3 years now, markets change. And you have to be prepared to put your hand in your back pocket and invest in new initiatives. And that might be a group of growers, putting $100,000 on the table and investing $1 million into a new crop, a new initiative where they can capture some of that value. That's what business is.
I'd add to that though. I would argue that value add is not for everyone, but I think that all farmers have the responsibility, or that fools not to actually be aware, as you said, of what the market wants and the fact that the market's changing. So even if as farmers we're not into value add, we need to be really aware of what the market is demanding, and be that the product type or the way the product's produced. I think that awareness is key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to, too, really understanding that market. I mean, I think we're all quite good at going, oh, I can grow this or I can produce this and, someone should buy it. But I don't think we often spend enough time actually understanding really what makes consumers tick and what gets them excited. And, I mean, we all make really irrational purchases from time to time because in our heart it just feels like the coolest thing to do. And, it's kind of tapping into that sense. And then, suddenly, it's not 40 cents extra on the bread that matters, It's when you've got that real emotional feel, but it's hard to understand consumers. And I think we've kind of focused on trying to tell people how we do things, but really understanding that consumer and understanding what makes them tick is really, really useful. And it's hard to do when you're quite disconnected from often a lot of your consumers. But I think that takes a lot of the risk out of it by understanding that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wim. My question's for Alison. It comes back to the 40 cents premium for New Zealand grown wheat when allowing or facilitating New Zealand growers producing the bread inputs. So you've got your 40 cents and 8 cents ends up with the grower. What happens to the other 32 cents? How is that redistributed back up through the supply chain?
It'll be determined by the supermarkets, or at the end. I mean, the supermarkets will drive that. I mean, they'll probably take the bulk of it, and then a bit will go to the bakers, and a bit will go to the millers.
Have you actually done the calculations to?
We're just doing that at the moment. We're doing two things. We're working out how to divvy up the supply chain, and we're looking at the logistics of how to make it happen from a point of view of actually getting enough New Zealand grown grain into the various places where it's got to go. So, I mean, we're just at the starting point of that piece of work. We didn't know whether, in fact, the consumers would be prepared to pay anything extra. So when we did the initial market survey, we were really surprised that it came back looking as positive as it did. And it was interesting because, they do all these meta-analyses, and so they don't actually ask, that, with the survey, will you pay more for New Zealand bread? It's all triangulated. And they said they didn't want Australian grain, and they absolutely wanted New Zealand. And at the moment, they're getting Australian and not New Zealand.
That sounds like a real opportunity. Thank you very much. There was a question in the back.
Yeah, we've got a question on Slido for Kate. What have you learnt about engaging your team in your vision? When employing people now, are there certain traits you look for in people?
Yes, there's always been certain traits that we've looked for in people. I guess the point is that sort of identifying and articulating that vision and values has shaped how we make decisions across the entire business. So actually the kind of staff that we're attracting, an example, we're over 50% female on staff. So we're attracting people who, the people who are applying are actually the ones who are sort of buying into what we're trying to do on farm. I mean, essentially we're just farming, we're just trying to feed our stock, but yeah, the people that we're starting to get apply for our jobs are the ones that sort of vision resonates with, I suppose. So it's become almost a self-serving thing.
Any more questions, ladies and gents?
I'll ask a question to Kate.
Sorry.
Oh, God.
There you go. I've got another one for you.
Kate, self-appointed addict of Mount Somers Station Lambswool Blankets.
Brilliant.
My question to you is, why don't you charge more if you're not covering your sharing costs when you've shortened the supply chain?
So our main share, like our main wool clip, we're very much price takers. So we just sell for whatever we can get. The Lambswool Blankets, the whole reason I started the Lambswool Blankets is that we were getting a pittance for our lambswool, and it just was quite upsetting. So the reason I started the Lambswool Blankets was to move up that chain and not be a price taker. So I do the maths when I'm working out the cost of production for our Lambswool Blankets on $10 a kilo for the lambswool.
Thank you so much. There was a question in the back.
Yeah, good morning. Question for Susan. Around African swine flu, I've heard that China might have resolved its kind of internal pork supply. Can you comment on what you're hearing and seeing in terms of have they overcome that major deficit they had that forced them to buy a whole lot of other protein? Where do you think that's at currently?
Well, I don't think they've, resolved the issue. They have tried to restock some of their farms, but the disease is still running rampant, really. So that's it's still there. They did manage to sort of alleviate some of the supply shortage by having some directives to people who are holding any form of stock of meat products to release those to the market. So importers could kind of see prices going up, and so it was a great opportunity to sit on product for a month or two and then resell because you'll get a higher price. So there were some government directives to try and free up that meat that had got sort of stuck in that supply chain like that. So we've definitely seen some freeing up, but the issue isn't resolved, and I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon.
I have a question here in the front.
Kate, a very clear message I got from you was that what's important is our customers' values and what they want to see in the product and how it's produced. And in that vein, I wanted to ask Allison, do you think regenerative agriculture is a value of the consumer or a value of the grower?
I think it's at this moment in time, from all of my readings and connecting, it's a value of growers. At this, I don't see it as a value of consumers. It's a grower momentum in the way in which growers want to grow. Now, if they can translate that into a story that the consumer embraces, then that's good. But if they don't, then it won't make any difference to their bottom line. But it might make a difference to the health and well-being and the sustainability of their farm.
But as a scientist, did you not say that you don't think regenerative agriculture is a worthwhile concept?
No, I never said that at all. Gosh, you weren't listening. Because regenerative
agriculture is normal.
No.
And regenerative is not.
No. Regenerative agriculture was a movement that was based, it basically bubbled up from, sort of North America, where the soils had been very badly eroded, and they recognized that they needed to improve the quality of the soils to drive sustainability. And that was absolutely right. So where you have soils that are incredibly depleted, regenerative agricultural principles are absolutely right, and they're based on sound scientific practices of enhancing soil health. If you already have soil that has organic matter of, sort of 7-8%, then you're not in that situation that generated that movement. They were down at 1 or 2%. That doesn't mean that you don't still want to improve your soil, because any improvement in soil is good for your farm business. I was just worried that if in New Zealand we embraced the mantra of regenerative agriculture, we might get tainted with the assumption that our soils were really poor quality soils, when in fact they are actually reasonably good compared to the rest of the world. That was the story I was trying to get across. So I'm not bagging regenerative agriculture, and we work with the various groups in New Zealand who are embracing that, and we're trying to take the very best ideas from that and implement them into mainstream cropping.
Thank you very much. Last question.
Can I make a last statement? This is just because I'm sitting here looking at you all. Do you know there's 42 men in here and 33 of you have all got blue checked shirts on? So just talking about diversity of thought. Enough said.
It's the first time I've been to one of these. There's been 3 women up the front.
Yeah.
Saying that, last question.
I'll ask the last one. Thanks for my blue check shirt there, Alison. Welcome back to Lincoln. This question is for Kate, but I just want to start off with something that Susan said. when she opened up, she listed all of these changes and shocks to the global economy. To what extent, and given the diversity of what you've got on farm at Mount Somers, Kate, to what extent are you starting to see some of the signals already reaching the farm gate? Are they already starting to arrive?
You mean the short-term signals from what's happened so far in 2020 or what's happened over the last 10 years?
No, let's go back to about the last 3 months of last year, so the last quarter of last year and now.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing price signals coming out of the processors in terms of not being able to process CALUs, scheduled prices slipping, dairy payout dropping, well, not the payout, the GDT dropping. So we're definitely seeing those signals come through. I guess the lessons that we've learnt in the last 10 years is that actually it's going to happen. It'll go up, it'll go down. Part of our resilience is around our broad mix of products, but also that knowledge that we have got the capacity just to hold on and ride it through and not sort of panic at the short term. So yeah, I mean, we're revising our budgets. We're expecting things to be a bit softer than we had hoped this season.
Well, that brings us to the end of the Q&A session. Thank you so much, Alison, Kate, Susan, for your outlook to 2020. I think what we have learned is we cannot predict the future. Anybody who thinks they can, please come and talk to me because I want to have the lotto numbers for this weekend. So it's all about being open to your outside stakeholders, being open for diversity and diversification on your farm. Ladies, thank you so much for being here. Audience, ladies and gents, thank you also so much for being here. The people that were looking at this online, thank you very much for sticking around with us, even with the technical twitches. We really appreciate that. Please follow us on blink.com. There you can actually get into a newsletter so that you can be updated on all the other events we're doing. Thank you very much. Thank you.